So, if you've been following the headlines in early 2026, the story you're hearing about Egypt is a pretty good one. An extended IMF program is in place, the country's credit rating is up, and after years of chaos, the currency finally seems to have stabilized. By almost every major metric, it looks like Egypt has been pulled back from the brink of total economic collapse. It's a compelling recovery story. But it leaves out one crucial piece of data. This number, $29 billion. That's what Egypt has to pay in debt service for 2026 alone. A figure so massive it forces you to look past the good news headlines and ask, what kind of recovery is this really? The whole issue boils down to a huge gap between two very different realities. On one side, you have the official story, the narrative of a managed success. But on the other side, you have the hard data. And that data reveals a very fragile stability, one that isn't propped up by a strong, self-sufficient economy, but almost entirely by outside help. When you look at the tools that were actually used to save Egypt, you start to see a pattern. Each one is either a one-time cash injection, like selling off a huge piece of sovereign land at Ras El Hekma, or it depends on things completely outside Egypt's control, like a brand new, fragile ceasefire in the Red Sea. This isn't a cure. It's economic life support. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, subscribe. We publish new scenarios and data breakdowns every week. Here's the roadmap for this breakdown. We're going to start by picking apart the recovery myth. Then we'll look back at the decade of debt that got us here. We'll analyze what we're calling the stabilised trap, lay out 3 possible future scenarios, and then connect the dots on why all of this matters to the rest of the world. To understand why this recovery feels more like a mirage, we have to go back and see how this trap was built. This wasn't some sudden crisis. It was built piece by piece over the course of a decade. After 2013, Egypt went all in on a specific growth model. Build huge infrastructure projects, a whole new capital city, new roads, massive power plants, and finance the whole thing with foreign loans. This created a lot of activity, but it totally failed to build up the export industries needed to actually repay those loans in dollars or euros. So when global interest rates shot up in 2022, that model fell apart. And the result is stark. External debt literally doubled in 8 years, from $84 billion to a peak of $168 billion. It's dipped slightly to $161 billion recently. But let's be clear, that is still a massive liability that has to be paid year after year after year. To get IMF support, Egypt had to devalue its currency. And not just once, repeatedly. Between 2022 and 2024, the Egyptian pound lost about half its value against the dollar. At one point, it took over 54 pounds to get just $1. That kicked off a massive inflation crisis, annual inflation hitting 38%, with food prices jumping over 50%. It wiped out the savings and daily purchasing power of ordinary Egyptians. When you put all these pieces together, you get what we call a dependency trap. Egypt is the world's biggest importer of wheat. It needs that wheat for a gigantic bread subsidy program that feeds around 70 million people. Politically, you can't touch that program, but fiscally, it's a black hole, especially when global food prices are high. And that forces Egypt to rely on financial support from Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia just to keep functioning. The biggest recent example of that support was the $35 billion Ras El Hekma deal with the UAE. It wasn't an investment in Egypt's future productive capacity, it was a fire sale. They sold off a prime stretch of Mediterranean coastline to generate emergency cash. It was a critical lifeline, but you can only sell that land once. So that brings us to right now, to the present day, and what we're calling the stabilised trap. It's a particularly dangerous place to be, where the absence of an immediate crisis is being mistaken for genuine long-term health. The IMF program. Yes, in February 2026, another $2.27 billion came through. That's good news. But if you read the IMF's own review documents, they flag an $8.2 billion financing gap for the fiscal year. They're still demanding politically toxic reforms, like cutting back on food subsidies. This IMF program isn't a graduation certificate. It's more like an ongoing compliance test, and Egypt is just barely passing. And this is the core of the problem. That first figure, $29 billion. That's Egypt's debt bill for 2026 alone. Now compare that to the combined revenue from Egypt's 2 biggest hard currency earners, the Suez Canal and tourism. Even if both have a record-breaking absolute peak year, they still don't bring in enough to cover the debt payment. This isn't a bad year. This is the definition of a structural problem. And that Suez Canal revenue, it's incredibly fragile. During the Houthi attacks, traffic plunged by 42%. The recovery everyone is celebrating is 100% dependent on a ceasefire that is just weeks old. Egypt's national budget is now essentially hanging on a geopolitical truce it has absolutely no control over. All of this creates a dangerous gap. The country's debt situation demands fast, deep, painful economic reform. But the political reality, with 30% of its 120 million people living in poverty, means the government can only manage a much slower pace of change. It's reforming at the speed its society can tolerate, not at the speed its creditors demand. So given all of this, where does the data suggest Egypt is actually heading? We see three distinct scenarios. The most likely path, roughly 60% probability, is what we're calling continued managed stabilisation. Egypt muddies through. It meets the bare minimum IMF targets. The foreign lifelines keep flowing. Not a recovery, but not a collapse either. The second scenario is post-program stress. This could kick in after the IMF deal ends in late 2026, when markets take a hard look at Egypt's underlying health without the safety net. That could spark a new crisis. And finally, the worst-case scenario, structural relapse, triggered by a major external shock, like that Red Sea ceasefire collapsing, which could lead to a potential default. So why does any of this matter outside of Egypt? An economic crisis in a country of 120 million people, sitting right on Europe's doorstep, is never a local event. For Europe, Egypt is a critical buffer managing migration flows across the Mediterranean. If the government's capacity to do that starts to crumble, the political consequences will show up in Italy, Greece, and Germany, almost immediately. For investors, if you hold a pension or an ETF with emerging market debt exposure, you're in the picture. A potential default in a country the size of Egypt carries a serious risk of contagion. And for everyone, any new disruption to the Suez Canal means global shipping costs go up. And that feeds directly into the inflation that central banks are still struggling to get under control. If this analysis changed how you see the situation, hit like. It helps other people find this kind of independent coverage. Let's put this moment into its proper historical context. The current IMF program is being celebrated as a success, but it is hardly Egypt's first. In fact, it's the 12th IMF program since 1962, and every single one had the same stated goal: economic stabilization. That history doesn't suggest a permanent solution. It suggests a pattern of temporary fixes. And so the data forces us to ask a harder question. It's not about whether Egypt was saved. The real question is whether saved and stable are actually the same thing. And if they're not, how long can that difference possibly be sustained?